July 25, 1939. The Bronx, New York. Irving Penn woke up that morning just like any other day. He showered. He dressed in his summer weight suit. He kissed his family goodbye. And at 7:55 in the morning, he walked out of his apartment building at 250 East 178th Street, heading toward the subway station. Irving Penn was 42 years old. He was a music publishing executive at G. Schirmer Incorporated, one of the most respected classical music publishers in America. He had no criminal connections, no enemies, no secrets. He was simply a man on his way to work. He never made it. A blue sedan had been waiting for him. Inside were 5 men. They had been watching the building for a week, waiting for this exact moment. As Penn walked toward the subway, the driver did a U-turn and approached from behind. A man stepped onto the running board, raised a .32 caliber pistol, and emptied the entire magazine into Irving Penn's back. Irving Penn died at Fordham University Hospital. He was buried a few days later. His family was left to wonder why. Why would anyone want to kill a classical music publisher? The answer was that no one wanted to kill Irving Penn. He was never the target. The men in that car had been sent to kill someone named Philip Orlovsky, a union official who lived in the same apartment building. Orlovsky had information that could hurt powerful people, and those powerful people wanted him silenced. But that morning, Philip Orlovsky had woken up early. He wanted to get a shave before work, so he left his apartment an hour before his usual time. Irving Penn, who happened to bear a passing resemblance to Orlovsky, walked out at his regular time instead. The lookout in the car, a low-level criminal named Jacob Migden, pointed at Penn and said, "That's him." And that was it. Irving Penn died because he looked like someone else, because he kept to his regular schedule while another man did not, because a group of professional assassins trusted the wrong person to identify their target. This was Murder Incorporated, and Irving Penn was far from their only victim. Between 1929 and 1941, an organization operated in the shadows of New York City. It had no official name. The newspapers would later call it Murder Incorporated, but the men involved simply called it the Combination or the Troop. According to law enforcement estimates, this organization was responsible for somewhere between 400 and 1,000 contract killings across America. That's not a typo. Between 400 and 1,000 people were murdered by a single organization over the course of roughly 12 years. Most of those cases were never solved. Most of those victims were never found. And for almost a decade, the men who did the killing operated with near total impunity. They were arrested dozens of times. They were never convicted of anything more serious than minor offenses, until one of them decided to talk. This is the story of Murder Incorporated, but more importantly, this is the story of the people they killed, the victims, the families left behind, and the prosecutors who finally brought the killers to justice. Before we go further, it's worth pausing to consider the scale of what we're talking about. Between 400 and 1,000 murders. That's the official estimate. Think about what that means. At the lower end of that estimate, 400 murders over 12 years works out to more than 30 murders per year, 2 or 3 people killed every single month, year after year, for more than a decade. At the higher end, 1,000 murders over 12 years means more than 80 murders per year. That's nearly 2 people killed every single week. And these weren't crimes of passion. These weren't bar fights that got out of hand or domestic disputes that turned deadly. These were premeditated professional executions carried out with planning and precision. Someone decided that each of those 400 to 1,000 people needed to die. Someone made a phone call, someone gave an order, and someone carried it out. The scale is almost impossible to comprehend, and yet it happened. In America, in New York City, during the lifetimes of people who are still alive today. To understand how Murder Incorporated came to exist, you have to understand what American organized crime looked like in the early 1930s. Prohibition had just ended. For 13 years, the sale of alcohol had been illegal in the United States, and criminal organizations had made fortunes supplying it anyway. Bootleggers became millionaires, speakeasies operated on every corner, and gangsters like Al Capone became household names. But with all that money came chaos. Rival gangs fought brutal wars for territory. Bodies piled up in the streets. The violence was bad for business, and it attracted unwanted attention from law enforcement. By the early 1930s, the most powerful crime figures in America realized they needed a new approach. Men like Charles Luciano Meyer Lansky and others formed what became known as the National Crime Syndicate. It was, in essence, a governing body for organized crime. Different groups would control different territories, and rackets and disputes would be settled through negotiation rather than gunfire. But even with a governing body, there would still be problems. There would still be people who broke the rules, people who talked to the police, people who threatened the organization's interests, and those people would need to be dealt with. The question was, how do you deal with them without bringing attention to the bosses who give the orders? The solution was elegant in its brutality. Create a separate organization, a team of professional killers who had no direct connection to the people ordering the hits. When someone needed to die, the bosses would contact this team. The team would send killers from out of town, people who had never met the victim and had no personal motive. The killing would be done. The killers would disappear, and if anyone was ever caught, they wouldn't be able to implicate the bosses who had ordered the murder. Two men were put in charge of building this organization. The first was Louis Buchalter, known by his childhood nickname Lepke. He was a Jewish gangster from the Lower East Side of Manhattan who had built a fortune through labor racketeering. He controlled unions in the garment industry, and he wasn't afraid to use violence to maintain that control. The second was Albert Anastasia, a Sicilian immigrant who had earned a reputation as one of the most violent men in the New York underworld. People called him the Mad Hatter and the Lord High Executioner. These weren't meant as compliments. Together, Lepke and Anastasia recruited killers from the poorest neighborhoods of Brooklyn, Brownsville, Ocean Hill, East New York. These were places where young men grew up hard, where violence was a way of life, and where loyalty could be bought for the right price. The killers who joined this organization came from both Jewish and Italian backgrounds. They were paid a retainer of around $1,000 per month, which was excellent money during the Great Depression. They received additional bonuses for completed jobs, and they waited for their assignments at a seemingly innocent location in Brownsville. Midnight Rose's candy store sat on the corner of Saratoga and Livonia Avenues in Brooklyn. It was run by a woman named Rose Gold, and from the outside it looked like any other neighborhood shop. Children came to buy penny candy. Neighbors stopped by to chat. But in the back of the store, there was a row of payphones, and those phones connected to crime bosses across the country. When someone needed to be killed, the call would come to Midnight Rose's. The killers waiting inside would receive their assignment, and they would go to work. The system was designed to be untraceable. The victim wouldn't know the killer wouldn't know why the victim had to die. And if the killer was caught, he couldn't implicate the person who had ordered the hit because he genuinely didn't know who that was. For years, it worked exactly as designed. Bodies turned up across New York and beyond. The police investigated, but without witnesses, without connections between victim and killer, without any of the usual threads that lead investigators to the truth, the cases went cold. Murder Incorporated was a machine, and the machine kept running. Joseph Rosen was not a criminal. He was a 46-year-old businessman from Brownsville, Brooklyn. He had worked hard his entire life building a small trucking company that delivered garments to non-union shops in Pennsylvania. It wasn't much, but it was honest work, and it supported his wife and son. Then Louis Lepke Buchalter destroyed everything Joseph Rosen had built. In the early 1930s, Lepke was expanding his control over the garment industry's labor unions. He ordered a work stoppage that effectively put Rosen's trucking company out of business. When Rosen complained, Lepke promised to take care of him, but the promises were empty. First, Lepke got Rosen a job with another trucking company. Rosen was fired within a year. Then Lepke set Rosen up with a small candy store, hoping the former trucker would stay quiet and make do with his diminished circumstances. But Joseph Rosen wasn't the type to stay quiet. He had been wronged, and he wanted compensation. He wanted justice. And as the years passed, he became increasingly vocal about what Lepke had done to him. By 1936, a special prosecutor named Thomas Dewey was aggressively investigating labor racketeering in New York. Dewey was brilliant, ambitious, and relentless. He had already put other criminals behind bars, and now he was coming for Lepke. Lepke became paranoid. Anyone who might testify against him became a potential threat. And Joseph Rosen, the candy store owner who wouldn't stop complaining about how Lepke had ruined his life, suddenly looked very dangerous. According to testimony that would later emerge in court, Lepke made his decision. Joseph Rosen had to die. On September 13, 1936, at 7:30 in the morning, Joseph Rosen opened his candy store at 725 Sutter Avenue in Brooklyn. He was alone. A team of killers was waiting for him. Among them were Harry Strauss, known as Pittsburgh Phil, one of the most prolific killers in Murder Incorporated's history. Also present were Emmanuel Weiss and Louis Capone. They rushed into the store and opened fire. Joseph Rosen was shot 17 times. According to police reports, the shooters were so accurate that a man's hat could have covered the entry wounds. Joseph Rosen died instantly. He was 46 years old. His wife and son lost a husband and father. His store stood empty, the front window splattered with blood, and the men who killed him disappeared into the Brooklyn morning. For 5 years, the murder went unsolved. No one was arrested. No one was charged. Joseph Rosen became just another statistic, another victim in a city full of violence. But Joseph Rosen's death would not be forgotten, because one day, the killers themselves would start talking. And when they did, Joseph Rosen's murder would become the case that sent Louis Lepke Buchalter to the electric chair. Justice would come. It would just take time. The Murder Incorporated killers operated with a certain professional detachment. To them, killing was simply a job. The victims weren't people. They were bums or marks or contracts. The dehumanization was deliberate. It made the killing easier. Harry Strauss, Pittsburgh. Phil was perhaps the most prolific of them all. According to prosecutors, he killed over 100 people during his career. Some historians believe the number may have been as high as 500. He used every method imaginable: guns, knives, ice picks, rope, drowning, strangulation, setting bodies on fire. "It's okay to do murder," Strauss reportedly said, "as long as I don't get caught." And for years, he didn't get caught. He was arrested 18 times in 13 years. As one prosecutor later noted, he was never convicted of anything more serious than smoking on a subway platform. But even Pittsburgh Phil had his limits. Even he followed certain rules. In 1937, word reached Murder Incorporated that one of their own, a man named Walter Sage, had been stealing money from the organization's slot machine operation in the Catskill Mountains. Sage was part of the crew. He knew the rules, and he knew what happened to people who broke them. According to testimony that emerged years later, Pittsburgh Phil and several others picked up Walter Sage for what Sage believed was a routine drive through the Catskills. During that drive, the killers attacked. Sage was stabbed 32 times with an ice pick. Sage fought back desperately. He grabbed the steering wheel and crashed the car into a ditch. But it wasn't enough. The killers finished the job. And then, in a gesture that revealed the killer's grim sense of symbolism, they tied Walter Sage's body to the frame of a slot machine and dumped both into Swan Lake in Sullivan County, New York. Sage's body floated to the surface a few weeks later and was discovered by tourists on July 31, 1937. Even among criminals, there were consequences for betrayal. The slot machine tied to Sage's body was meant to send a message: steal from the organization, and this is what happens. Dutch Schultz was one of the most powerful crime bosses in New York during the 1930s. Born Arthur Fliegenheimer in the Bronx, he had built an empire during Prohibition, controlling bootlegging, gambling, and numbers rackets throughout the city. But by 1935, Dutch Schultz was in trouble. Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey was building cases against organized crime, and Schultz was one of his primary targets. Schultz had already beaten one tax evasion case, but he knew Dewey wouldn't stop. The prosecutor was too ambitious, too determined. Schultz came up with what he thought was a simple solution: kill Thomas Dewey. He brought this proposal to the commission, the governing body of organized crime. He laid out his plan and asked for permission to proceed. The commission refused. The other bosses understood something that Schultz didn't. Killing a prosecutor, especially one as prominent as Thomas Dewey, would bring down the full weight of law enforcement on all of them. It would be catastrophic for business. The heat would be unbearable. Schultz was furious, according to accounts from the time he stormed out of the meeting, declaring that he would kill Dewey himself with or without permission. The commission made their decision quickly. Dutch Schultz had become a liability. He had to go. The contract went to Murder Incorporated. On October 23, 1935, two killers named Charlie Workman and Emmanuel Mendy Weiss walked into the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey, where Schultz was having dinner with several associates. Schultz was in the restroom when the shooting started. Workman found him there and shot him below the heart. Meanwhile, Weiss opened fire in the dining room, killing Schultz's accountant and wounding his bodyguards. Schultz stumbled out of the restroom and collapsed at a table. He was rushed to the hospital, where he lingered for nearly a day, drifting in and out of consciousness. He was delirious with fever, and his final words were a strange, rambling monologue that has puzzled historians ever since. "A boy has never wept nor dashed 1,000 Kim," Schultz said at one point. "Mother is the best bet, and don't let Satan draw you too fast." No one has ever been able to determine what he meant. Dutch Schultz died on October 24, 1935. He was 33 years old. His death had an ironic consequence. Thomas Dewey, the prosecutor Schultz had wanted to kill, went on to become the governor of New York. He ran for president in 1948, coming so close to victory that one newspaper famously printed the headline, "Dewey defeats Truman," before the final results came in. Thomas Dewey lived until 1971. He owed his life, in a sense, to Murder Incorporated, the organization that killed the man who wanted him dead. For nearly a decade, Murder Incorporated operated without consequence. Bodies turned up across the country. Investigators hit dead ends, and the killers continued their work confident that they would never face justice. That changed in 1940. The beginning of the end came from an unlikely source. A small-time criminal named Harry Rudolph was arrested on a minor charge and started talking to save himself. He gave police a name, Abe Rilles. But before we talk about Rilles, we need to understand what law enforcement was up against. For years, detectives across New York had been investigating a series of seemingly unconnected murders. Bodies would turn up in vacant lots, in the trunks of abandoned cars, in lakes and rivers across the region. The victims often had ties to the criminal underworld, but not always. Sometimes they were witnesses. Sometimes they were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The investigations hit dead ends for the same reason over and over again. There was no connection between the killer and the victim, no motive that investigators could identify, no witnesses willing to come forward, no evidence that could link the crime to anyone specific. Detectives knew in their guts that these murders were connected. The methods were too similar, the timing was too convenient. But knowing something and proving it in court are two very different things. District attorneys across the region struggled with the same problem. They could identify suspects. They could build theories, but without witnesses, without physical evidence, without the kind of proof that would convince a jury, they couldn't make cases. The prosecutors needed someone on the inside to talk. They needed someone who knew the organization from within, who could explain how the system worked, who could name names and provide the corroborating details that would make cases prosecutable. For years, no one talked. The code of silence held firm. Anyone who even thought about cooperating with authorities knew what would happen to them. They had seen it happen to others. The punishment for betrayal was swift and final. But in 1940, cracks began to appear. Abraham Rilles, known as Kid Twist, was one of Murder Incorporated's most prolific killers. He was short, stocky, and unremarkable in appearance, but he had personally participated in at least 11 murders. By some accounts, the number was closer to 30. When Rilles learned that his name had come up in a police investigation, he made a calculation. He knew what happened to people who became liabilities. He had seen it firsthand. He had done it himself. So Abe Rilles made a decision that would change the course of American criminal history. He decided to talk first. In early 1940, Rilles walked into the Brooklyn District Attorney's office and offered to tell them everything he knew. In exchange, he wanted immunity from prosecution. The deal was made, and Abe Rilles started singing. What followed was unlike anything prosecutors had ever seen. Rilles had an extraordinary memory. He could recall the details of dozens of murders, names, dates, locations, methods, and the names of everyone involved. He testified for 12 consecutive days, laying out the inner workings of Murder Incorporated in devastating detail. According to prosecutors, Rilles' testimony helped solve 85 murders. 85 cases that had gone cold were suddenly wide open, and the arrests began. The task facing prosecutors was immense. They had testimony about dozens of murders spanning nearly a decade. They had to choose which cases to pursue first, knowing that the death penalty was on the table. They had to build airtight cases using testimony from admitted killers' testimony that defense attorneys would attack relentlessly. Assistant District Attorney Burton Turkis led many of the prosecutions. He worked around the clock, reviewing testimony, preparing witnesses, building the legal framework that would send killers to the electric chair. The trials were sensations. Newspapers covered every detail. The public, which had lived in fear of organized crime for years, finally got to see the inner workings of the murder machine. They heard about the candy store headquarters, the payphones, the contracts. They heard killers describe their crimes in chilling, matter-of-fact detail. Harry Strauss, Pittsburgh. Phil was tried for the murder of Irving Feinstein, a bookmaker whose body had been strangled and set on fire. Strauss tried to fake insanity during the trial, growing a long beard, refusing to bathe, and chewing on a briefcase strap while babbling incoherently. The jury wasn't fooled. Strauss was convicted and sentenced to death. Martin Goldstein, another key member of the organization, was convicted alongside Strauss. Both men were executed at Sing Sing Prison on June 12, 1941. Harry Maione and Frank Abendondo were convicted of the murder of George Rudnick, who had been strangled and stabbed repeatedly with an ice pick. Both were executed at Sing Sing on February 19, 1942. But the biggest case was still to come. Prosecutors were building a case against Louis Lepke Buchalter himself for the murder of Joseph Rosen, the candy store owner who had been shot 17 times back in 1936. Abe Riles was going to be the star witness. He had overheard Lepke order the hit on Rosen. His testimony would send the head of Murder Incorporated to the electric chair. But Abe Riles never got to testify against Lepke. From the moment Riles started cooperating with authorities, his life was in danger. The organization he was betraying had killed hundreds of people. They would certainly try to kill him too. Prosecutors took extraordinary precautions. Riles and several other cooperating witnesses were placed in protective custody at the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island, Brooklyn. The hotel was chosen because it could be easily secured. The witnesses were kept on the 6th floor in rooms with views of the ocean. Police officers were stationed around the clock. For more than a year, the arrangement worked. Riles testified at multiple trials, helping to send his former associates to the electric chair. He traveled to California to testify in other cases. He became the most valuable witness in the history of American organized crime prosecution. But the organization hadn't given up on silencing him. According to reports that emerged later, a contract had been put out on Riles' life. The price was reportedly $100,000, an enormous sum, in 1941. On November 12, 1941, Abe Riles was being held under police protection at the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island, Brooklyn. He was in room 623 on the 6th floor. 6 police officers were assigned to guard him around the clock. At some point during the night, something happened. Early that morning, Riles' body was found on the roof of a kitchen extension approximately 42 feet below his window. Bed sheets had been tied together to form a makeshift rope with one end attached to a radiator valve in his room. The official explanation was that Riles had been trying to escape and fell when the bedsheet rope gave way. But that explanation raised more questions than it answered. Why would Riles try to escape? He had immunity. He was going to walk free after the trials were over. Escape made no sense. How did he get past 6 police officers? The guards claimed they heard nothing. No struggle. No screams. And why would a man use bed sheets to climb down from a 6th floor window when he could simply walk out the door? Lucky Luciano, one of the most powerful crime bosses of the era, reportedly claimed years later that the police had been paid $50,000 to throw Riles out the window. The underworld had a saying about Riles. The canary could sing, they said, but he couldn't fly. The truth of what happened that night in November 1941 has never been definitively established. The case remains officially unsolved. But the consequences were immediate and profound. Without Riles' testimony, the case against Albert Anastasia, the co-founder of Murder Incorporated and one of the most violent men in organized crime, could not proceed. Anastasia was never prosecuted for his role in Murder Incorporated's killings. He would live for another 16 years until October 1957, when he was shot to death while sitting in a barber chair at a hotel in Manhattan. That murder was never solved either. Despite the death of their star witness, prosecutors pressed forward with the case against Louis Lepke Buchalter. They didn't have Abe Relis anymore, but they had another witness. Albert Tannenbaum, a former Murder Incorporated member who had also turned informant, testified that he had been present when Lepke gave the order to kill Joseph Rosen. It was enough. On November 30th, 1941, just 18 days after Abe Relis fell to his death, a jury found Louis Lepke Buchalter guilty of first-degree murder. Emmanuel Weiss and Louis Capone, two of Lepke's lieutenants who had participated in the Rosen killing, were convicted alongside him. All three were sentenced to death. The appeals took years. Lepke's lawyers argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the testimony of other criminals couldn't be trusted, that their client had been denied a fair trial. The appeals failed. On March 4, 1944, Louis Lepke Buchalter walked into the death chamber at Sing Sing prison. He was followed by Louis Capone and Emmanuel Weiss. Reporters who witnessed the execution noted that Lepke seemed calm, almost cooperative. He placed his own arms into position to be fastened to the chair. He leaned his head forward into the helmet that would deliver the fatal shock. He said nothing. At 11:16 in the evening, the switch was thrown. Louis Lepke Buchalter became and remains to this day the only major organized crime boss in American history to be executed by the government. The man who had ordered the deaths of dozens, perhaps hundreds of people, finally faced the same fate he had inflicted on so many others. Joseph Rosen, the candy store owner, who had simply wanted compensation for his destroyed business, had his justice at last. It had taken 8 years, but it came. When you walk through Brownsville, Brooklyn today, there's nothing to mark where Midnight Rose's candy store once stood. The building is gone. A small bodega occupies the corner of Saratoga and Livonia now. Children still buy candy there. The neighbors still stop by to chat. They have no idea what happened in that building more than 80 years ago. The Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island was demolished in the 1990s. A senior citizen's home stands in its place now. The spot where Abe Relis fell to his death is a parking lot. The Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan, where Albert Anastasia was shot in the barbershop, has been renamed the Park Central. The barbershop itself is now a Starbucks. The chair where the Lord High Executioner died was sold at auction for $7,000. It's now an exhibit at the Mob Museum in Las Vegas. History moves on. Buildings are torn down and rebuilt. Memories fade. But the victims of Murder Incorporated deserve to be remembered. Joseph Rosen deserves to be remembered. A man who worked hard, who built a business, who lost everything through no fault of his own, and who was murdered simply because he wouldn't stop asking for what he was owed. Irving Penn deserves to be remembered. A man who had no connection to organized crime whatsoever, who died simply because he bore a passing resemblance to someone else, and because he walked out of his apartment at his usual time on an ordinary summer morning. The hundreds of other victims, most of whose names we will never know, deserve to be remembered. Murder Incorporated killed for money. They killed for power. They killed because they were told to kill. They reduced human beings to contracts, to marks, to problems to be solved. But the people they killed were not contracts. They were fathers and sons, husbands and brothers. They had families who loved them, friends who missed them, lives that were cut short. And in the end, the killers themselves met justice. Pittsburgh. Phil died in the electric chair. So did Lepke and Weiss, and Capone and Maione and Abbandondo. The machine they built was dismantled piece by prosecutors who refused to give up. Burton Turkis, the assistant district attorney who sent 7 Murder Incorporated members to the electric chair, later wrote a book about his experiences. He called it simply Murder Incorporated. In that book, Turkis described what he saw when he looked into the eyes of the killers he prosecuted. They all had killer's eyes, he wrote. When you look into them, you see no hate, love, fear, or courage, and you never can tell what your subject is thinking. Turkis dedicated his career to bringing those men to justice. He succeeded, and in doing so, he proved that even the most powerful criminal organizations can be broken. Even the most careful killers can be caught. Even the victims who seem forgotten can have their day in court. Murder Incorporated operated for roughly 12 years. In that time, according to law enforcement estimates, they killed between 400 and 1,000 people. But they did not escape justice forever. The trials of Murder Incorporated established principles that still guide prosecutors today. The importance of witness testimony, the value of offering immunity to lower-level criminals in exchange for information about their bosses, the need for persistent investigation even when cases seem hopeless. Thomas Dewey, the prosecutor that Dutch Schultz wanted to kill, went on to reshape American politics. Burton Turkus became a crusader against organized crime. The cases they built, the precedents they set, changed how law enforcement approaches organized crime to this day. And the victims. The victims are why it matters. Joseph Rosen mattered. Irving Penn mattered. Every person whose life was cut short by a knock on the door, a bullet from behind a stranger with no connection and no remorse. They all mattered. Murder Incorporated treated human life as a commodity, as something that could be bought and sold and ended for the right price. The prosecutors who brought them down proved that human life is worth more than that. That justice, even delayed, can still arrive, that the powerful are not immune to consequences. It took time, it took courage, it took witnesses willing to risk everything by telling the truth. But in the end, Murder Incorporated fell, and the names of the victims, at least those we know, deserve to be remembered. Joseph Rosen, Irving Penn, George Rudnick, Irving Feinstein, Walter Sage, Dutch Schultz, the Amberg brothers, Morris Kessler, Albert Schumann, and hundreds more whose names have been lost to history. They were not contracts. They were not marks. They were not problems to be solved. They were people, and this is their story. There's one more person whose story needs to be told, not a victim of Murder Incorporated, but a man who dedicated his life to bringing them down. Burton Turkus was born in Brooklyn in 1902. He grew up in the same borough where Murder Incorporated would later make its headquarters. He went to law school, passed the bar, and eventually became an assistant district attorney in Kings County. In 1940, when Abe Relis started talking, Turkus was assigned to the Murder Incorporated prosecutions. For the next several years, he immersed himself in the darkest corners of the criminal underworld. He listened to killers describe their crimes in clinical detail. He built cases that seemed impossible, and he sent 7 men to the electric chair. The newspapers called him Mr. Arsenic because of his deadly effectiveness in the courtroom. But Turkus wasn't in it for the glory. He was in it for the victims. In his book, published in 1951, Turkus wrote extensively about the people Murder Incorporated had killed. He didn't sensationalize. He didn't glorify the killers. He told the stories of ordinary people whose lives had been stolen. He wrote about Joseph Rosen, the candy store owner. He wrote about Irving Penn, the music publisher. He wrote about dozens of others, trying to give names and faces to victims who had been reduced to statistics. Turkus understood something important. The crime wasn't just the killing. The crime was the erasure. Murder Incorporated didn't just take lives. They tried to erase the very existence of their victims, dumping bodies in lakes, burning them beyond recognition, making them disappear so completely that even their families would never know what happened. The prosecutions weren't just about punishing the guilty. They were about restoring humanity to the victims, about saying these people existed, these people mattered, these people deserve justice. Turkus spent the rest of his career fighting organized crime. He gave lectures across the country. He wrote columns for newspapers. He appeared on radio and television warning about the dangers of letting criminal organizations operate unchecked. He died in 1982 at the age of 79. By then, the Murder Incorporated trials were history studied in law schools and remembered in crime documentaries. But Turkus never forgot the victims. In interview after interview, throughout his long career, he returned to their stories. Joseph Rosen, Irving Penn, the people who deserve to be remembered. Murder is not a business, Turkus wrote. It is a tragedy, and every victim is someone's child. When we look back at Murder Incorporated today from the safety of more than 80 years distance, it can seem almost unreal. The nickname, the candy store headquarters, the payphones, the professional assassins waiting for their assignments like salesmen waiting for leads. It sounds like something from a movie. And indeed, Murder Incorporated has been depicted in films, television shows, and books countless times since the trials ended. But it wasn't a movie. It was real. Real people died. Real families were destroyed. Real communities lived in fear. In the neighborhoods where Murder Incorporated operated, everyone knew who the killers were. Everyone knew about midnight roses. Everyone understood that certain topics weren't to be discussed. Certain questions weren't to be asked. The silence was enforced by terror. People who talked to the police ended up dead. People who testified against the organization ended up dead. Even people who simply knew too much ended up dead. That's why Abe Relis's decision to turn informant was so significant. For years, no one had been willing to break the code of silence. No one had been willing to risk their lives to tell the truth. Relis changed that. He was no hero. He was a killer himself, responsible for at least 11 murders by his own admission. He turned informant not out of conscience, but out of self-preservation. He wanted immunity from prosecution. He wanted to save his own life. But the effect of his testimony was profound. He proved that the code of silence could be broken. He proved that even the most powerful criminal organizations were vulnerable. He proved that one person willing to tell the truth could bring down an empire built on murder. After Relis, others followed: Albert Tannenbaum, Seymour Magoon, Sholem Bernstein. One by one, members of Murder Incorporated decided that their best chance of survival lay in cooperation, not silence. The organization that had seemed invincible began to crumble. The killers who had operated with impunity began to face justice. The machine that had run so smoothly for so long finally broke down. And the victims finally got their day in court. Consider for a moment what it must have been like for Joseph Rosen's widow and son. For 5 years after his murder, they had no answers. They knew who had killed their husband and father. Everyone in the neighborhood knew. But the killers walked free. The man who had ordered the killing, Louis Lepke Buchalter, was one of the most powerful criminals in New York. He seemed untouchable. And then suddenly, everything changed. The arrests began. The trials started. Witnesses took the stand and described in chilling detail exactly what had happened on that September morning in 1936. Joseph Rosen's widow testified at Lepke's trial. His son testified too. They sat in the courtroom and watched as the man who had destroyed their family was finally held accountable. When the jury returned a guilty verdict when the judge pronounced the death sentence, they must have felt something. Relief perhaps, or vindication, or maybe just exhaustion after years of waiting for a justice that seemed like it would never come. We don't know exactly what they felt. The historical record doesn't capture those moments in detail, but we know they were there. We know they saw justice done. And we know that their husband and father murdered because he wouldn't stop asking for what he was owed was finally avenged. The same was true for Irving Penn's family, the music publisher who died because he looked like someone else, because he walked out of his apartment at the wrong time on the wrong day. His killers were eventually identified. Jacob Migden, the lookout who made the fatal misidentification, pleaded guilty and was sentenced to prison. The case was solved. Irving Penn's death remained a tragedy. Nothing could bring him back. Nothing could undo the senseless waste of his life. But at least his family knew what had happened. At least the people responsible faced consequences. At least there was some form of closure, incomplete as it was. That matters. That has to matter. Because if the victims are forgotten, if their stories are never told, if the killers escape without consequence, then something important has been lost. The principle that every life has value. The principle that justice, however delayed, can still be achieved. The principle that we do not forget. Murder Incorporated believed they could kill with impunity. They believed they were untouchable. They believed that their system was so perfect, so insulated, that no one would ever be able to connect the crimes to the criminals. They were wrong. The system that seemed perfect had a fatal flaw. It relied on human beings, and human beings, when their own lives are on the line, will sometimes choose survival over loyalty. They will talk. They will testify. They will break the code of silence. Abe Relis broke that code, and once it was broken, it could never be fully repaired. The lesson of Murder Incorporated is not that organized crime is invincible. The lesson is exactly the opposite. Even the most sophisticated criminal enterprise can be brought down. Even the most careful killers can be caught. Even the most powerful bosses can face the electric chair. It takes time. It takes persistence. It takes courage from prosecutors willing to pursue cases that seem hopeless. It takes witnesses willing to risk their lives to tell the truth. It takes a society that refuses to accept murder as just another cost of doing business. But it can be done. It was done. And the victims of Murder Incorporated, those whose names we know and those whose names have been lost, deserve to have their stories told. not as entertainment, not as glorification of the criminals who killed them, as memory, as witness, as testimony. Joseph Rosen was 46 years old when he died. He had worked hard his entire life. He had a wife who loved him and a son who needed him. He was killed because he wouldn't stop asking for justice. Irving Penn was 42 years old when he died. He was a respected professional in his field. He had no criminal connections whatsoever. He was killed because he walked out of his apartment at the same time he always did. George Rudnick, Irving Feinstein, Walter Sage, the Amberg brothers, Morris Kessler, Albert Schumann, names on a list, entries in court records, victims of a machine that treated human life as a commodity. But they were more than that. They were people who lived, who loved, who dreamed, who mattered. And when we tell the story of Murder Incorporated, we should remember them first. Not the killers, not the bosses, not the organization that thought it was above the law. The victims. Because in the end, that's what true crime should be about. Not glorifying violence, not celebrating criminals, but remembering the people who were lost, honoring their memory, bearing witness to their lives. Murder Incorporated operated for roughly 12 years. 7 of its members were executed by the state. Dozens more went to prison. The organization was destroyed. The candy store on the corner of Saratoga and Livonia is gone. The Half Moon Hotel is gone. The barber shop where Albert Anastasia died is a coffee shop now. Oh, but the victims deserve to be remembered, and as long as we tell their stories, they will be. Joseph Rosen, Irving Penn, and all the others. Rest in peace. As the years passed, the story of Murder Incorporated became part of American folklore. The trials were dramatized in films. The killers became characters in books and television shows. The candy store, the payphones, the code of silence. All of it became the stuff of legend. But there's a danger in turning real events into entertainment. The danger is that we forget the human cost. We forget that behind every sensational headline, behind every dramatic courtroom scene, there were real people who suffered real losses. Joseph Rosen's family had to rebuild their lives without him. Irving Penn's colleagues at the music publishing company had to come to terms with his senseless death. The families of all those victims, known and unknown, had to find ways to move forward. Some of them never got closure. Some of them never learned what happened to their loved ones. Some of them died without ever knowing the full truth. The prosecutions of Murder Incorporated were a triumph of the American justice system, but they were also a reminder of how much damage had already been done. All those trials, all those convictions, all those executions, they couldn't bring back a single victim. They couldn't undo a single murder. What they could do and what they did was send a message that organized crime would not be tolerated, a message that killers would face consequences, a message that the rule of law would prevail even against the most powerful and ruthless enemies. That message still resonates today. When prosecutors build cases against organized crime, when witnesses find the courage to testify despite the risks, when investigators refuse to give up on cold cases, when society demands accountability for violence. The prosecutors who brought down Murder Incorporated showed that it could be done. They showed that no criminal organization is too powerful to challenge. They showed that justice, though it may be delayed, can still be achieved. Burton Turkus, William O'Dwyer, Thomas Dewey, and the many detectives, investigators, and prosecutors whose names are less well known. They all played their parts. They all contributed to the eventual downfall of an organization that had seemed invincible. And the witnesses who found the courage to testify. Abe Relis, whatever his motives, broke the code of silence. Albert Tannenbaum followed. Others came after. Each one took a risk. Each one helped to bring down the machine. Even Relis' mysterious death couldn't stop the momentum. The cases were too strong. The evidence was too compelling. The prosecutors were too determined. One by one, the members of Murder Incorporated faced justice. Pittsburgh Phil, Bugsy Goldstein, Happy Mayone, Dasher Abundando, Mendy Weiss, Louis Capone, and finally, Louis Lepke Buchalter himself. The machine that had run so efficiently for so long was dismantled piece by piece, and the victims at last had their day. If you visit Brownsville, Brooklyn today, you'll find a neighborhood that has changed dramatically since the 1930s. The tenements are mostly gone. The character of the area has transformed. The memories of Murder Incorporated have faded. But if you know where to look, you can still find traces of the past. The street corners where the killers once gathered, the buildings where the victims once lived, the sites where crimes were committed, and justice was eventually served. History leaves marks on the places where it happens. Not always visible marks, not always obvious ones, but marks nonetheless. The story of Murder Incorporated is part of the history of New York City, part of the history of organized crime in America, part of the history of how a nation struggled to establish the rule of law in the face of organized violence. It's not a comfortable story. It's not an entertaining story despite all the films and television shows that have tried to make it one. It's a story about death, about the people who died, about the families they left behind, about the prosecutors who fought to bring their killers to justice, about the witnesses who risked everything to tell the truth. That's the story that deserves to be told. That's the story that deserves to be remembered. Not as entertainment, not as nostalgia, not as glorification of criminals or their crimes, as history, as memory, as witness. The victims of Murder Incorporated lived, they loved, they dreamed, they mattered, and as long as we remember them, they always will. This has been the story of Murder Incorporated. Thank you for listening.